listening to Europe's #1 pro wrestling podcast.
Set no substitutes.
Bringing you the best in pro wrestling interviews, news, and opinions with Mr. Stevie Knight.
We've had many well-known guests on the Steve Knight Show. We've started off with Magnus, we've had Danny Boy Collins, we've had Marty Jones, Rockstar, Spud. Unfortunately, we've dropped down a little bit today. We've got Greg Lambert. How are you, Greg?
That's very nice of you, Steve. Here's for that. That's only because I texted you yesterday and I said pretty much the same thing. I'm in exalted company.
It's a pleasure to have you on, my friend. You are one of my closest associates in the wrestling business.
Why, thank you. The feeling is mutual, or at least it was.
Yeah, until about 30 seconds ago.
Yes. No.
So, for those that don't know, Greg, give us a brief history of your involvement in the wrestling scene.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, been a fan probably, or was a fan, from about the mid-'80s, watching British wrestling on ITV. And then when British wrestling was taken off ITV, started watching the American stuff, the WWF as it was then, and became aware of the fact that British wrestling was still going on, and went to a show called Revival at Crystal Palace, which was headlined by Eddie Guerrero and Grandmaster Sexay, you might remember from Too Cool, Brian Christopher, Jerry Lawler's son. But there was also a load of British guys on that show who I didn't know very much about. Guys like Jody Fleisch, Johnny Storm, Alex Shane, Doug Williams, Nikita. Watched all them, thought, wow, there's a lot of talent in this country, and became hooked on British wrestling. And from there, I got involved in British wrestling. I became, initially I was a commentator for a show in Ipswich, promoted by Dan Reed. I became a writer for Power Slam magazine. I then got on the Wrestle Talk radio show as like a pundit with Alex Shane, who then invited me to become a heel manager with the FWA. He then invited me to become a promoter with the FWA, and I then went on to promote my own company called the XWA. I brought out a book, Holy Grail, The True Story of British Wrestling's Revival. I opened a training school for wrestlers. I've been a commentator for Preston City Wrestling, which is what I do now, and I still manage. I manage a wrestler called Johnny Fear, who you know very well. And, pretty much a jack of all trades, master of a couple, perhaps.
No, it's true to say that you are pretty hot on the UK wrestling scene right now. If I was to ask you a question about certain individuals, certain companies, we could certainly bring people up to date with what's happening in the UK right now.
Yeah, I like to keep an eye on what's happening. It's part of the job, you know. I'm a real life journalist as well. I write for my local paper. I've done for 12 years. Still write for Power Slam. I'm sort of involved with the British wrestling column in Power Slam as well. So yeah, I like to keep my hand in and find out what's what. So
let's go back though. Let's go back to the beginning. When did we first meet, Greg?
Well, I was thinking about this, Steve, and I think it was the night of my first show as a promoter. I think it was at the Morecambe Dome, God rest its soul.
I know, that's devastating, isn't it?
Yeah.
Devastating.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll come more and talk about the Dome, but many a good night we've had at the Dome.
We did, yeah. I think this was the first one. I was promoting for the FWA, and we did our first show. We had Juventud Guerrera against Doug Williams as the main event. This would be April 2003. And I think the night before, you had promoted a show with your good friend Richard Young at Cleethorpes Winter Gardens, would it be?
It would have been. God rest its soul.
Rest its soul as well.
Yeah.
we have the we don't have the Midas touch, do it, when it comes to venues?
We've killed all these venues.
And I think from memory, I think on that show, was the main event of your show, was it Chris Hamrick against Doug?
I think it could well have been, yeah, something along those lines.
I think it was, because I think
this was I was literally off injured about this time, so yeah, I think it was. I just helped the FWA organise this show, but I think it might have been, yeah.
Well, from what I remember, I think Chris Hamrick did this fake injury.
That's right.
In the match, and everybody was raving about it. And I think that was how we first came to start talking, because I think Alex sort of was talking about this that happened the previous night, and you were there backstage with Youngie, and I think he introduced me to you, and I think we met again when you wrestled on a show, one of Chris Curtis's shows in Stoke.
This is the first time I remember us meeting, yeah. This is the first time I remember us meeting, because I think this is one of my first shows back after taking a couple of years off when I'd had my neck injury. So, this was about the time when the internet was getting really popular. And you was one of the first internet writers, wasn't you, really? You had your, what was your blog called at the time?
I had a website called WrestlingX.
That's right. And it was a good thing at the time, obviously, to get your name back on the internet. And I remember one of the columns that you did was called Stevie's Night. And I remember that. I still remember that to this day, because it was a good way of because people read that. The promoters read it, the other wrestlers read it. And it was a good way to get your name straight back out there again. So, and it was interesting to me because we pretty much hit it off straight away from then on, didn't we? So, and FWA, a much vaunted story of FWA. How did you get involved with the FWA?
Well, it was like I said before, really. It was from meeting Alex at Revival in February 2002. I interviewed him on the day for Wrestling X, and I did a massive review. I mean, it was just ridiculous how big this review was. It was such a big review. I think I had to do it in 3 parts. And I think Alex and Dino Scarlo, who was involved in running FWA with him at the time, they read this review, and they also read some of the columns I was writing on the website, because I was writing them in character. I'd developed this amplified version of my real-life profession as a heel journalist, this know-it-all expert. And I was writing these columns on the internet and having a go at a few of the fan favourites in both the WWF at the time and also some of the British wrestling fan favourites as well. And from what I've been told, they actually read this stuff and they thought, this guy's got something about him, and that's when they put me on the radio. And then I brought that personality and my ability to speak over the airwaves, and I got that across to the listeners, and they became, more impressed. And from there, it was like, right, debut as a heel manager, and this was at Walthamstow in February 2003. Jerry Lynn's on the show, Juventud Guerrera, Doug Williams, Robbie Brookside, and there's me with literally no experience, no training, just thrown in at the deep end as a manager. Not really much of an idea what to do other than what I'd seen on the television over the years from likes of Bobby the Brain Heenan, Jimmy Hart, people like that. So that was quite a baptism of fire, but it went quite well. They booed me out of the building, which I think was the desired response.
Always a good sign.
Always a good sign, and it went from there.
It's fair to say at this point you was literally a punter. You was a wrestler, as we all are. But I mean, literally at this point, you was a wrestling fan that had just got a lucky break.
That's right, very very much so. Yeah, and I'm very appreciative for being given that opportunity. And I was also very conscious at the time as to how I would be treated. How I'd be received by the wrestlers in the back. I had very little idea about wrestling etiquette and I knew there was a hierarchy. I knew that there were veterans backstage and there were the newer guys, and I knew you had to go around and shake hands with everybody, and I did that. And I knew and I just basically I have a lot of genuine respect for anybody who gets in the ring and puts their bodies on the line to entertain people like like you did and like the wrestlers do. So, I think that came across. I think they realised that I was, genuine. I wasn't there to, I wasn't a journalist. I wasn't there to, find out the latest scoop for my internet site. I was there to work. I was there to contribute to the FWA, and I think they realised that quite quickly, which was, good for me, I think.
The FWA had a lot of people, didn't they, that would do a lot of things backstage. Because I think that there was a lot of fans, wasn't there, that were just hopefully just trying to get involved with the FWA product. Because the FWA captured a niche at the time, didn't they? They had this, what I would call a travelling army of fans that were like a football team, like an away travelling football team at the time that came to all these shows, that spent a lot of money. What do you think they did at the time that captured people's imagination?
I think, they were one of the very first promotions to use the internet to promote their shows effectively. They had their own little forum on the internet, which was followed by people all over the country, all over the world. There was there'd be fans who'd come over from, maybe not all over the world, but from Europe certainly. I know FWA had fans coming over from Germany to watch some of the shows. And I think the other thing they did that was not too many other people were doing. There had been British promoters who had brought over some of the name Americans. All Star had done that, TWA, a few other promotions as well. But what FWA did is they tapped into this new generation of American indie wrestlers who are just starting to catch fire in the States. People like AJ Styles, Samoa Joe, Daniel Bryan as he is now, Bryan Danielson as he was then. And they brought those guys over when they were just starting. They were just starting to become known. Put them in matches against some of the British guys who had talent. And by doing that, it gave the British guys a bit of a rub, bit of higher profile. People like Johnny Storm, Jody Fleisch, Zebra Kid, Roy Bevis, people like that started to become better known to British wrestling fans because of their association with these Americans.
Now, a lot of those FWA guys, they kind of disappeared after the FWA, didn't they? A lot have gone on to do more things. Some of the guys have disappeared. Who do you think are some of the guys that have not got the recognition they deserve and have seemed to have dropped away from the FWA days? Can you think of any?
I mean, there's a few that are still going. I mean, Johnny's still going. Johnny Storm's still going.
Well, he's about 55 now, isn't he?
How old is Johnny? 36? Something like that?
He's got to be. He doesn't look a day older than he was when he was about 22. That's the problem.
He's baby-faced.
He is, isn't he?
Grabbing by the cheekbones and cheeky face that Johnny's got, yeah. Well, Johnny Jody pretty much disappeared, didn't he? I mean, he had that retirement in 2003 that was a complete mystery. It came completely out of the blue and nobody was really quite sure what had gone on. And then he came back, and he was never the...
I know what went on, Greg.
Yeah, you probably do. Nobody told me anything, you see. I just hear rumours, and I think, oh, God, I don't want to hear that. So I tend to shut it out. But yeah, he came back, and he's never quite the same, was he? Never quite as he was.
No. I don't think his heart was in it. I think that the difference between... I think you actually said this in your book, which we'll talk about, between Johnny and Jody was I think, just the literal... passion that they had for wrestling at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Because Jody, and I believe this to this day, could have been somewhere now. Because I think I mean, even now, everyone's knock on Jody was that he was too skinny. I mean, now he's a really big fella now, a really, really big guy, and he's not wrestling anymore, which is just absolutely incredible. So, but there was a lot of talented guys, but it was a long time ago now. We're talking 10 years ago now. It's absolutely unbelievable to think. For me especially, because it doesn't seem like 2 minutes ago to me that we were all there doing all of that. And
no, fine. I just want to say about Jody, though. I think Jody's probably the most naturally gifted wrestler I've ever seen from Britain.
Yes, absolutely.
Other than Adrian Neville, other than Pac, I would say he's the most naturally gifted. Not only a flyer, he was a brilliant seller, Jody.
Exactly, he was a brilliant seller, and his number one thing, he was likeable.
He was very likeable. In real life, lovely guy.
Yeah.
And that really came across to people. And at that time, 2002, 2003, if someone had said, right, there's going to be any guy in Britain who's going to become a major star, even a mainstream star, you'd have gone Jody Fleisch.
You would, yeah, you would, absolutely. And it's a shame that he didn't. But, yeah, is there anybody else that you can think of?
Well, I mean, I managed the family, and Paul Travell, he put himself through. Paul Travell... He didn't look like a wrestler, did he, Paul, particularly? He didn't have the body, that you'd associate necessarily with a wrestler. But Paul was passionate about FWA, and he really wanted to get in there and do anything possible to entertain. And he was the hardcore guy of FWA, and he was involved in a few incidents which were, particularly that incident at the York Hall in 2003, where he got set on fire, went in a stunt that went slightly wrong, and ended up with quite serious burns and in the hospital. And then he was back out and ready to go again. That was the kind of guy Paul was. And I think because of that, the intensity of that period of time, not just the toll it took on his body, but also on his mind, the pressure to perform at a high level, that's part of the reason why Paul stepped away, and he's not involved